economics in general. And he's the one that definitely got me to think about going into teaching. Because when I went into a PhD program, I was really interested in the policy world. I wanted to work for like Cato or something. And meeting him and having him talk to me is what really inspired me to consider teaching. And it turned out to be a really good suggestion because I love it. So I owe that to Pete. I'm very grateful to him for that. And he's also one of the modern leaders in Austrian economics, really determined, in many ways setting the agenda for what modern Austrian economics is. And it's an immense pleasure and honor to have him here to give this talk on socialist calculation debate, the topic that he's definitely one of the undisputed experts in the world on. So, welcome Pete Boettke.
I'm always thrilled to be in an environment like this because there's so many of you that I've worked with in the past or I've met at various different organizations and what, so I'm thrilled to be here. It has been too long for me. I started my professional career actually at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. And at that time I would come to Hillsdale a couple times actually. I would come down to do that because Charles Van Eaton was the department chairman at the time and Richard Ebeling was teaching here. And they ran, one of the big events was they ran a big event that was published in the Champions of Freedom series, which I don't know exists. They still do those. And it was a big book on Austrian economics and the new directions. And there was a professor here named Alexander Stromos, who was a Russian historian. And he was actually a very accomplished professor. And I gave a talk on perestroika, and he yelled at me and told me, we don't need perestroika, we need destroika. We need to destroy, you know, like that. So that was, I told Portia on the way in here that that's the only time I think I've ever been outflanked in my criticism of what was going on in the Soviet system. But anyway, so it's my understanding that this is primarily an industrial organization class. So there's two things I want to get out of the way right up front. Okay, the first thing is the important role that the calculation debate plays in the field of industrial organization. The calculation debate was critical to Ronald Coases' development of the theory of the firm. All right, Ronald Coase just passed away a couple weeks ago. Coase is a fantastic teacher. He actually is one of the core people that form what we call the Virginia School of Political Economy. At the University of Virginia, where Coase taught, when he wrote his problem of social cost paper as well as his FCC paper, it was Coase, a man named G. Warren Nutter, and Jim Buchanan who formed the foundation of what's called the Virginia School of Political Economy, or what you might get in your political economy courses is later referred to as public choice. So public choice economics, the Virginia School of Political Economy represented kind of three branches. Transaction cost economics of Ronald Coase, property rights economics of Warren Nutter, and public choice economics of Jim Buchanan. At the time that they were at the University of Virginia, all of these were blended together to do comparative institutional analysis. All right, that's what those guys were trying to do. How do you compare the arrangements and alternative institutional arrangements on economic performance? Okay? So where did Coase get his idea from? Well, Coase was a student at the London School of Economics when F.A. Hayek was a professor at the London School of Economics. And his teacher was a man named Arnold Plant. And Arnold Plant was presenting to them the problem of socialist calculation as being debated by Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek. And in that context, Ronald Coase asked himself the question, okay, well, why can't we just grow into one giant firm and have, you know, USA Inc.? And the answer for that was what he learned from Mises and Hayek, that you're going to run into these costs associated with organizing it that direction. That's not going to be possible. But then Coase asked himself the flip side question, which is, why is it that we have any firms at all? Why wouldn't we just have transactions, market transactions for everything? So why wouldn't we just have spot markets, right, for every single thing that we engage in? Well, we don't do that either. And that's where he just started to develop the idea of transaction costs, right? Think about the term, transaction costs. Those are the costs associated with what? Trading on the spot. And so what do? You end up by developing a theory of the firm which has limits. Those limits are shirking costs and calculational chaos and information costs. That's the Mises-Hayek end. And then on the other side, what are the other costs associated with transaction? Right? Those are your transaction costs. And in between is where you have the realm of the firm. And that's why Coase was able to describe how firms are organized. It's basically team production. Right? And so that's the first thing I want to get across to you, is that this debate and this discussion had a big impact on your theory of the nature of the firm, which is a major part of the theory of industrial organization. Way to understand the history of industrial organization theory is Ronald Coases wrote his paper on the theory of the firm in the 1930s, and it sat there dormant. Okay? And neoclassical price theory treated firms as nothing more than their cost curves and their production functions. All right? So the firm was a black box. And then what happens is a man named Oliver Williamson, who later on came along and won the Nobel Prize, what he did was he arbitraged two literatures. All right? Because there's a great business historian named Alfred Chandler who tried to explain how it is that businesses like GM and other businesses form these big corporations and how they organize their affairs. And how do they organize their affairs? That's strategy literature. And then the transaction cost literature. And what Williamson did was he pushed the two of those together. And then from then on, industrial organization has had to deal with all these things like firmness and, what's the sort of domain of the firm and all these things. Okay? So, fascinating stuff. Look out the window, all right, and understand that the blackboard serves as a tool for helping us understand what's out the window, rather than just focusing on the blackboard. Industrial organization is a really fascinating subject. Second thing is that in the process of articulating the calculation argument, because of the British economists who responded to Hayek, they developed a model of what they called market socialism. Okay? And because of that, Hayek started to understand the unique differences in his approach to economics versus the standard approach to economics, and in particular over the functional significance of the model of perfect competition. Okay? So what Hayek started to argue is that competition has to be seen as a discovery procedure, not as a state of affairs by which we judge market activity against. Think about it in a very simple way. Competition to Hayek is a verb. Competition to the standard modeler is a noun. Okay? Hayek wants to see the activity. We engage, we compete with one another. It doesn't define an end state of affairs. And therefore, the judgment over the welfare judgments, which again, IO and an antitrust policy, is built on a different foundation once you follow the Mises and Hayek position. In the standard way in which we do welfare economics applied to industrial organization, we do a thing called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. Right? We basically have two models. There's all kinds of multiple models of markets, but basically for antitrust, we have two market models: competitive or monopolistic. All right? That's going to be our structure. Then the performance is going to be judged on whether or not a firm prices equal to its marginal cost or deviates from marginal cost pricing. And its performance, all right? So you have structure, conduct, pricing policy, and then performance is going to be, if it prices equal to marginal cost, that means the firm is going to, performance is going to be optimal. If it deviates from marginal cost pricing, you're going to have suboptimalities. What does government as a deus machina then do? Steps in and fixes the suboptimality to make it look more like an optimum. That's what antitrust is supposed to do. Okay? Hayek's whole argument is that this is a wrong way by which to judge market activity. Now, Hayek wasn't the only critic of antitrust policy. Let's go back to what I said about those Virginia school guys. G. Warren Nutter wrote his doctoral dissertation under Milton Friedman. His doctoral dissertation was on the extent of enterprise monopoly in the United States. So when you think about, well, you're at Hillsdale, so you guys are a little different because you have Burton Folsom, okay? So you don't, but imagine that you're not at Hillsdale. I know it's hard for you. So imagine you're not at Hillsdale right now, and instead you're in Mrs. Jones' 8th grade civics class. And you hear the term robber barons, right? What you're thinking about is a guy in a top hat with like a handlebar mustache, right? Who probably took a widow and tied her to the railroad tracks. Which I never quite understand why they do that, right? Because what's the point? She's not going to pay her rent if I tie her to the railroad track. But anyway, so there's some kind of logical contradiction in the cartoons. But actually, see, I can't, Portia, you've made me so old. I can't even, you guys didn't even have Captain Planet, right, when you were a kid? That was, old for you? Like, maybe your older, uncle or whatever listened to Captain Planet? You remember Captain Planet dimly, right? Captain Planet, right, is a total, right, remember who Captain Planet's always fighting against? The monopolistic warlord. Right, remember? Right, the guy who's, having, destroying the environment and blowing up the world, and Captain Planet, Earth, Wind, and Fire or whatever are going to, wipe it out, okay? So this guy's over here, he's a monopolist. That's the robber baron. That's your version of the robber baron, right? Is Captain Planet's nemesis. And so this guy is going to do what? He's going to price above his marginal cost and earn these monopoly profits. He's going to restrict output, raise price, and earn those monopoly profits. And so what we need to do is be a trust buster. So the argument is that under capitalism, right? Dog-eat-dog competition leads to an idea where you have an increasing concentration of capital. That's a hypothesis. But it's a hypothesis which a lot of people believed. Here comes G. Warren Nutter. Let's look. During the late stage of capitalism, did we see an increasing concentration of capital, or did we actually see dispersion? And Nutter engaged in the empirical techniques of economics at the time, and showed that actually markets had become thicker, not more, concentrated during that period of time. And then the whole Chicago school led a revolution in antitrust policy. One of the things that they did was they said, hey, don't just define the market narrowly, define the market more generally. If I define the good narrow enough, everything's a monopolist. I need to understand and look at substitutes. So I'm going to consider market share. I'm not going to look at the automobile companies of just Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and then say, what's the domestic share of those firms? It's an oligopoly or whatever. Instead, I have to look at also Toyota, right? Hyundai, Honda, all the other competitors. And by broadening the notion of the market, I end up by understanding better how the conduct in that market goes. Okay? So that was the new learning in Chicago, also challenged the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. It was another upshot of this ideas. But the first forays into them, again, were both out of this calculation debate. So it's important to see the roots of it in there, even though it went in various different directions. By the way, Warren Nutter's second book was The Extent of Industrial Growth in the Soviet Union, published in 1962, in which he challenged the Soviet growth rates. So Warren Nutter is a pivotal kind of figure of being in both of these areas. So anyway, this essay, or this is an essay, but it's a presentation, Hayek, Market Socialism, and the idea is the science, ideology, and public policy. And this was it was a Hayek memorial lecture at the LSE. It's one of the coolest things I ever did in my life. I'm a pretty boring academic, so when I was teaching at Oakland University, and I was a young pup, I was a young professor. Unfortunately, I wasn't an old professor. But I was a young professor. I went to work the first day, but no one was at work, and the reason was they were on strike. I didn't know this, and the department chairman called my home and talked to my wife, Rosemary, is Pete there? I need to tell him he can't go in the office. She says, oh no, Pete was so excited to go to work. He went in at 6 o'clock this morning. Oh, this guy's all freaked out. Calls me in my office, says, Pete, I understand you're in the office. I said, yeah, it's just awesome. I can't believe I'm so excited to be teaching here. I'm preparing my lectures for tomorrow, right? Actually, I was working on paper, but anyway, that's what I told him. And he sits there and he says, well, you got to leave. And I said, what do you mean I got to leave? He goes, we're on strike. And I go, on strike? For what? And he goes, working conditions. And I said, did someone get a nasty paper cut? He did not laugh. He just stared at me through that phone, said, get the hell out of the office. And then they settled. Gary will remember this because this is back back when Blanchard and Bowman were in control of the state of Michigan finances, and they agreed to a 7% increase in the faculty salaries built into their contract for 3 years. And then people want to know why the hell Michigan was having, financial problems. 7% increases built into the faculty things. It was amazing. Anyway, I took my 7% and that was fine. But anyway, I didn't agree with it, but I liked it in my pocket. Anyway, so I am an academic. I don't do very exciting things or whatever. But I got to go to the LSE, give the Hayek Memorial Lecture, and I stood on the very stage that Hayek gave his Prices in Production. So for econ nerds like us, this is like a big thrill. I was kind of stage struck. I was like, oh my God, I'm at the Gold Theater. And everyone's like, what's so cool about the Gold Theater? Hayek stood on this stage. A lot of people stood on this stage. I'm like, I don't care, but Hayek was here. So anyway, this is that lecture. The basic argument goes as follows, is that Hayek's critique of socialism is grounded in his scientific understanding of economics. His ideological position is a consequence of his science, not the other way around. I think this is really, really important for young people that are excited about ideas of liberty, is to understand the difference between being a libertarian economist or an economist who has libertarian conclusions. I want to say to you that you should be an economist who has libertarian conclusions, not a libertarian economist. Okay? Economics is a science no less rigorous of a science than physics. We don't refer to a physics as, a Republican physicist, right? We sort of say physicists, right? Who, and what's the reason why? Here's the dilemma about economics, folks. Good economics, there's only good economics and bad economics, all right? So Milton Friedman's right about that. But what's the content of good economics varies depending on, how we have this debate with. But economics in general puts constraints, puts parameters on people's utopias. So the most left-wing economist is going to be more right-wing than your typical sociologist or literature professor, because they understand that there's a constraint on choices, right? It's about choice within constraints, which means that you can't just say pink fairies and tutus and we can deliver like the poor, right? And a lot of people, that's what they want. They want pink fairies, or like you guys all watch South Park, even though you're not supposed to do that. It's an Hillsdale thing, maybe. But you know about the underwear gnomes, right? Economists are not supposed to have underwear gnomes, all right? Whereas, sociologists live on underwear gnomes, right? That's like their whole theory, blah, 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 solve poverty, right? And so we recognize that there's always these scarcity constraints. And, Larry Summers recognized those scarcity constraints, so that's why he was against the Kyoto Treaty. All right, Paul Krugman understands scarcity constraints when he's an economist, not when he's a New York Times columnist. But when he's an economist, he understands scarcity constraints. Barack Obama, no, he doesn't understand scarcity constraints, right? That's the that's the problem. That's the pink fairies and the tutus, okay? So Hayek's ideology is an outgrowth of his science, not the other way around. And I want to suggest that Hayek's position in this debate had direct policy relevance during his life, and it still has lasting relevance today for public policy. I'm not going to talk about monetary economics at all, because that's not the topic, but just to give you an example, Hayek in the Constitution of Liberty, all right, which, by the way, Margaret Thatcher, as you walk through your little thing, you see that beautiful statue of Margaret Thatcher. It is actually really cool. I mean, it's the coolest of all your statues, I think, aesthetically. But, she took the Constitution of Liberty and slammed it down and said, this is our book. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means it was a coffee table book for the conservatives. And everyone said, oh, yeah, I really love that book, but they didn't read it. But everyone pointed to it. But if they read it, one of the things that Hayek tries to do in that book is he says, what would public policy look like if every public policy action had to be consistent with the rule of law? That's what the Constitution of Liberty is all about. Rule of law is the overarching principle. Everything has to fit to that principle, which the number one aspect of that is what's called a generality norm, which is that no policy could benefit any other group without benefiting all of the groups. So that eliminates all interest group politics, okay? All special interest politics, everything like that. Think through that. When he gets to the chapter on money, he tries to ask the question, what would a monetary policy look like that followed the rule of law? Well, one of the things it's never going to do is be inflationary, because inflation gives distributional benefits. Some parties benefit, other parties lose, right? So it can't fit that thing. So you can't, money can't go like that. Larry White, just a week ago, maybe it's 10 days now, testified in front of the House on the issue of banking policy or monetary policy since the Great Recession. And look it up, all of you, it's easy now for all of you to do this. But what White's talk is on is the rule of law and monetary policy. And it finds its roots, again, back in this kind of discussion. All right, as I'll go through this argument. I'll try to get through this quickly to open up for questions. So I think thinking through what Hayek's position is, or how Hayek ended up by being one of the first economists to emphasize institutional economics, was precisely because technical economics always takes place within a set of institutions, but we took those institutions so much for granted that we stopped paying attention to them, so we thought we could get the benefits of a market economy in an institutional environment which had nothing to do with a market economy. Okay? And what Hayek said was, wait a minute, folks, we have to rethink this, because the reason why we have those benefits from the market is because those institutions of private property, freedom of contract, freedom of pricing, all right, the lure of profit and loss, penalty of loss, okay, but the lure of profit. One of the things that you always find, and I'm sure your professors here emphasize, it is a profit and loss system. Okay, the loss side is very, very important. If you think about like the financial crisis, one of the easiest ways to think about what went on with that is to just say to yourself, in a world where I can privatize profits and socialize losses, why would I expect things to work out any other way than what they did? Okay? Because imagine if I said to you, you look like you're a nice, respectable young lady, and I say to you, hey, we're going to go to Vegas. What goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas, and you're heading to Vegas, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bankroll you so that every bet that you make, you get to keep the winnings, but any loss you make, I cover for you. So what wheel are you going to play? Are you going to go to Vegas and sit there at the slot machine and just go like, nickels, right? Or are you going to, put down, what are you going to do?
I'm going to go put down everything I can.
Yeah, because I'm covering your losses, but you get them off. So, by the way, raise your hand. That's Goldman Sachs. Okay? And, right, that's exactly what Goldman Sachs has been operating under for 30 years. Okay? Or, Bear Stearns. Or, by the way, Lehman Brothers. But then, like when Lehman Brothers went to get the bill paid, we said no. And so then what did everyone else do? They're like, are you kidding me? We now have to pay? So what did they do with all the money that they had? Yes, thank you. Raise your hand. Tell everyone, show your, come on, audiovisual aids. Right, they held on to everything. Like, Daffy Duck, I'm a happy little miser, right? When he gets the little thing on Pismo Beach. Yeah. All right, so. Let's see. So his position, if it was appreciated, I want Hayek's position today to be appreciated more for its scientific than its ideological. I don't want him to be a coffee table book. So we have to sort of walk through the argument, so it's not just a coffee table book, but instead actually an inspirational book, so that someone like Margaret Thatcher saying this is our book, it would mean something. Okay. For most audiences, I would have to go through this, but you're all Hillsdale kids, so you're like, I always kid around about George Mason. I always say that the graffiti at George Mason is at Tulloch Votes. Right? Right? The graffiti here probably, I don't know, I love Mises to pieces or something, right? So you guys have been through this, right? You sort of know this. So I don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but what Hayek's substantive political economy is made up of is a mix of various different continental theories at the turn of the century, in which you have Karl Menger at the core and the idea of spontaneous order. You have Wieser, who was actually his direct thesis advisor, who was talking about opportunity cost and imputation theory. Imputation theory is very important because it's, why do I raise pigs? Because you like bacon, right? The value of the pig is derived from the value of the bacon that you eat. If you didn't eat bacon, we wouldn't take care of the pig. Okay? That's true of iron ore, just like it's true of the pigs. Okay? That's called imputation theory. How do I impute the value back? Now, in a capitalist economy, we have to impute these values back all the time, right? Because we're engaged in these roundabout processes of production in which, sorry, give me that a second. Right? This is a pencil, right? You've all probably seen this. Leonard Reed's iPencil, right? So you hold up a pencil and you say, none of you could make a number 2 pencil. And you think, oh, it doesn't look that hard. This is a number 2. So imagine this is yellow, and the thing that you had to take your SATs with, all right? Anyway, so I'm sitting there and I say, none of you. Now, what he makes you do is go through the thought experiment. Do you know how to get the wood? Do you know how to carve the wood? Do you have the tools, know how to make the tools that carve the wood? Do you know how to make the paint that leads to the dye? Right? He goes through all of that extensive division of labor that's required just to produce a simple product like a pencil. How do each of those stages get a price? Right? That's imputation theory. That's what Hayek was early on in his career. That's what his dissertation was on. That's what he worked on. Okay? And that's under Wieser. All right? And then he goes and works, with Mises, in which he's working with Mises on business cycle theory, and the idea of, and that's built in the work of Ludwig Sell, and the idea of capital and expectations, the nature of the way in which a capital structured economy is organized and how monetary policy interferes with that. And then, of course, we have Mises's contributions to economics, which are singular and great, and Hayek is his greatest student, in quotes, in that sense. And those are mainly business cycle theory and the problems of socialism. That's his subset of economics. The way I like to suggest to people when they're thinking about, this is mine, not yours, right? When I like to think about this issue having to do with the relationship between Mises and Hayek, is that Mises, in my mind, is the greatest economist that ever lived, and Hayek is his greatest student. Okay? Now, it's also the case that I like to suggest to students that what they should do is they should read Hayek as if you were a Misesian. What do I mean by that? I mean, emphasize all of the logic of action points. So pick up Hayek and read for the logic of action. Then pick up Mises and read for invisible hand or spontaneous order. And it's the merger of those two things, this Mises-Hayek paradigm that I think is the most promising and progressive for future research in economics from that perspective. But that's not what I want to talk about here. I want to talk about just Hayek, and I think the way to understand what Hayek is doing is to see him as following up on Mises's research project. Now, what's interesting about this is that Mises is not in English yet. Okay? So if you do any of the history of thought, you will find out that when Hayek came to the LSE, all right, Robbins originally wanted Mises to come to the LSE. Mises wasn't going to move. Hayek moved as the younger version, and Mises's books are not available in English. They're all still in German. So everyone came to understand Mises after Hayek had already provided a kind of translation of Mises himself. Right? Like a summary of Mises's position, including Mises's famous socialist calculation debate. Its English translation is in Hayek's book that he brings out on the problems of collectivist economic planning. But the theory of money and credit is not available in English until Hayek and Robbins get it to come out. The book Socialism is not available. All this stuff doesn't come out until Hayek's at the LSE already for 5 years. And Robbins had been already trying to translate Misesian arguments into English during that 5-year period as well. And so we Austrians understand the Mises-Hayek evolution, but to the rest of the world it's Hayek and then this old codger who's his teacher, finally getting translated. And so I think it's important to see that what Hayek is doing is following up on Mises's questions, clarifying those questions, and providing more subtle answers. Here's the other thing. Mises wrote in an intellectual culture of the 19th century. That is, you put your arguments in big 1,000-page tomes. Hayek mastered the art of the scientific article. So he wrote The Use of Knowledge in Society. All right? The scientific culture, especially in the English language, had already moved to being a journal culture. Mises was still writing tomes like John Stuart Mill did. So one of the things that's really funny that I recommend that you all look up is Henry Hazlitt's reaction to when Mises calls him when he moves to the United States in 1940. Because Hazlitt says, I thought Mises was dead already. You know, he had just written wonderful reviews of Mises' stuff and everything like that. He goes, but he was like a product of the 19th century. I thought I was reading, he says, it might have been someone called me up and said, hello, John Stuart Mill here. You know, like that. Because he's like, I had no idea that he was still kicking around or whatever. And, you know, and the guy's like, hey, you know, Hazlitt, Mises here, you know, because Hazlitt wrote good, you know, reviews of Mises' books. But think about it this way. Business cycles, problems of socialism, different political and economic systems, liberalism basically, interventionism, those are the same questions that Hayek is going to devote himself to. I also should add in here methodology, but I want to focus just on the substantive political economy. Okay. Now, what's interesting about it is they're intertwined fates, intertwined position, but different professional fates. Because Mises is a significant contributor to the science of economics. So much so, by the way, that you should remember that in 1969, he's named Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association. It's a huge award. Not only that, in the country of Austria, he is given the highest scientific honor for his contributions to the science of economics. Paul Samuelson, in an obituary of Bertel Ohlin, no reason why you need to know that name except that he was a famous economist, from Swedish economist at one point. What Samuelson did was he tracked who he thinks would have won the Nobel Prize in economics had the Nobel Prize been given in economics starting when they gave the Nobel Prize in the other sciences. Okay? And Mises is one of the early winners. Samuelson points that out. So Mises is not some schlep that was like, you know, outside of scientific respectability. He just got hit with a lot of bad timing. Right? So he tries to come to the United States in the midst of World War II. Okay? He comes to the United States in the midst of World War II. His German book, Human Action, when it's published in German, only has a very limited print run because there's a paper shortage. Right? Because of World War II. All right? So then when his book finally does get published, it's published by Yale University Press in 1949, reviewed in the New York Times. Okay? So it's not like it's not, you know, getting paid attention to. All right, Mises goes to work for NBER because he doesn't want to work for a university because he can make more money working at NBER, which he works at from 1940 to 1944. Now, how old is Mises now? He's 64 years old. And he decides to find an academic appointment that's appropriate for a man of his accomplishments. Mandatory retirement in the United States at this time is like 60. So Mises is 4 years beyond the time and he starts looking for a job. Second thing that's important to keep in mind is he moved to New York City. Now, why was he so wedded to New York City? The area that he lived in New York City was called Little Vienna. It was all Austrian immigrants. Mrs. Mises loved Vienna. Now, you guys are not old enough, but the faculty members here are old enough. When the wife wants something, the wife gets it, right? So it doesn't make sense when Mises gets called from UCLA to go teach there that he says, oh, that's barbaric. Right? LA? Barbaric? Why would that be so? Well, if you're used to Little Vienna, you don't want to go live in Hollywood. That's like, you know, gauche or whatever, right? So you're not going to do that. So where would Mises have taught? Okay, so he would have been quite happy teaching at Columbia. He would have been quite happy teaching at maybe Princeton. But, you know, pretty much anywhere else, no, that's not going to happen. So NYU. That's where he taught. And, you know, and that's where he hung out. And by the way, from 1944 to 1949, he's like the kingpin faculty member at NYU. Right? He's one of the only faculty members that has a secretary, and they treat him very wonderfully. Now he's 69 years old. And by the way, this was his teaching method, is to First semester, students turned the papers in. He gave everyone an A because they turned a paper in. The dean came to him and said, Professor Mises, you can't do that. He says, okay. Next semester, he gave everyone a C. They said, you can't do that, all right? And so by all imagination, all reports, what he did was he based it, I'm not kidding you, he weighed the size of the paper. So if a student handed in a paper that looked like this, they got an A. If a student handed in a paper like this, they got a C, and that was like life. And so that's the way he chose to do his things, because he'd never been really a teacher, right? He'd always been a researcher and mixed his teaching in, and he was European. And in Europe, they didn't have tests like this. They had oral examinations, all right? And so they didn't have the normal, like, American tests. He didn't fit in. So Hayek fits into American culture. That's the issue. He fits into the British culture first very easily. Mises is always alien to these different intellectual cultures. He's a European intellectual stuck in a non-European world, when Europe is in fact fraying and falling apart. As Mises says, I began my career thinking I would be a theorist, and I became nothing more than a historian of decline. Right? So, and think about his lifetime, right? Fascism, communism, fascism, war. That's what he sees. All right, that's his life. Okay? So it's a different kind of view. All right. So out of this mix of these people and these ideas that we had here, Hayek ends up by focusing on these three elements. Economics is a coordination problem. Focus is on the dovetailing of plans. How is it that this pencil gets produced? Right? That's the dovetailing of all of the division of labor that must be coordinated to produce that. That becomes Hayek's main research project. The mystery of the mundane. All right? Shoes on your feet. How do they end up there? Okay? And what's the coordination of all this economic activity that takes place? The second point is, man, that coordination process requires us to process an infinite amount of information that none of us is in control of or can even possibly imagine. It's all dispersed throughout this economy in millions of different individual plans and purposes that individuals are pursuing. And yet somehow we have to translate all the subjective trade-offs that all those individuals are making into objective knowledge for me to make my trade-offs. And that's the mystery of the price system. The price system, coordination is the problem. The competitive market is the solution. Right? That's Hayek's position. All right? Now, the third thing is, why doesn't everyone else see this? Right? So, like, I have this view too. So I don't have a key here, but imagine this is a key. That's what I think economics is. I think economics is a golden key. You take Professor Wolfram's class, you are introduced to the golden key called the economic way of thinking. Once you possess it, you can unlock any mystery in the world. I understand that Hillsdale is classical and you have all the other disciplines. Trust me, this is the sexiest. There is no other discipline that has this key. Okay? This is it. All right? Right? This is it. You plug that key in, religion. Got it. Plug that key in, marriage. Got it. You know, plug that key in, parenthood. Got it. Right? Death. Got it. Right? Everything. All right? It is the key. And the horror story is that so many economics professors who introduce you to this golden key do it in the blandest and most boring way possible. Here's the key. Right? Like that. So look up Ferris Bueller, Bueller, right? That's what people think of economics professors. Instead, they have the key to the universe, okay? And Hayek understood that. He has a key to the universe. He has the price system right in his palm that can explain all of this. And now, not only do the general public not get it, but my fellow economists don't get it. And he says, right, what's going on? Right? What is going on? And so then he starts saying, well, you must not be understanding the role that the institutional framework plays in allowing the price system to work. If economics is about coordination, coordination is about exchange, we have to recognize that it's about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. Okay? The institutions in which you find yourself are going to dictate how it is that you engage in their transactions. And sometimes those institutions are going to be wealth enhancing, and sometimes they're going to be wealth destroying. And I can't treat the institutions antiseptically, which, by the way, was the explicit goal of Samuelson and mid-20th century economists. We're going to develop an institutionally antiseptic theory. And Hayek is countering that by saying, no, we have to have a genuine institutional economics, which is alongside of our economic theory. Now, again, like I said, methodology should be in there. The reason why methodology should be in there is because one of the reasons why economists tended to poo-poo the institutional framework was because they had the wrong methodological lens by which to assess scientific contributions. All right, so they started thinking that all they could do was science is measurement, and if you can't measure, measure anyway, rather than the idea that I'm going to do the historical work to understand the institutional patterns. So Hayek starts emphasizing the liberal institutions, and this starts with the road to serfdom, and it continues with the Constitution of Liberty, and then law, legislation, and liberty. All of which are trying to get you to understand the institutional framework which is necessary for a free economy to operate. And that we can't deal with the operation of the free economy unless we deal with the operation of these institutional frameworks. So this is a long quote. My wife makes fun of me all the time because she says, Pete, it's a PowerPoint, not a power paragraph. But I'm old school, so I'm throwing this up there. The whole point of this, I'm not going to read this, but it basically summarizes Hayek's detour from being a technical economist into this broader social scientist because he has to solve that broader social science to solve his technical problems in economics. Okay? So that's the point of this story. Okay, so here's how to understand. Can do this quickly, Yvonne. Watch me. All right. Hayek's contribution to economic socialism, the start state is the acceptance of Mises's calculation argument. Now, you've done the calculation argument. Without private property in means of production, there's no prices in the means of production. Without price in the means of production, there's no way to assess the relative scarcities of the means of production. Without the mechanism to understand the relative scarcities, there's no way to understand or invest in project A or project B. You can't engage in economic calculation. Right? It's an impossibility theorem, right? It's not that, oh, I can give it a good old try. I don't have the means by which to make the assessment. I don't know A or B, or the way Mises put it, I don't know whether or not to lay railroad tracks in platinum or railroad tracks in, with steel. Now here's the rub. Railroad tracks in platinum are technologically actually a better thing. Smoother metal, you could last longer, all that stuff like that. Why don't I do that? It's because you have to sort out from the array of technologically feasible projects those which are economic, right? And that means that their opportunity cost of their alternative use isn't so great, all right, compared to the alternatives here, right? And that's the economic calculation point. All right, so Hayek's point is that's correct, and it's unassailable logic. Now, the problem is that Bozo Brown over there doesn't believe it, and he's going to implement it anyway. So what's going to happen? So what's going to happen is that despite the recognition of Mises's truth, people are going to try to calculate in a world that they can't calculate, and what's the world going to come out? That's where the road to serfdom comes from. The road to serfdom is the unintended, undesirable consequence of attempting to do something that you can't achieve in practice, and then you get derailed. That's why the book is dedicated to the socialists of the world. It's a tragic tale. You're trying to swim across the Atlantic Ocean, but you just jumped in there with your, Speedo on and started swimming, and you got like 2 miles out, and then you sank. Right? The economist's response, by the way, is to come along and do the equivalent of saying, oh, imagine if I put a jet engine on your back. Right? Now, all of a sudden, you can speed across the Atlantic. But that's not swimming. That's called flying. No one ever said flying was impossible. I can fly across the Atlantic. Yep, can do that. But I can't swim across the Atlantic, okay? So the question that Hayek is going to ask is, what is the unintended, undesirable consequences? And so this is his contribution here, building on Mises's insight and ending with the road to serfdom. The progression of the argument goes very simple. It goes from private property rights, which provide us with incentives, to prices and the role that prices play in providing us with information, profit and loss, with providing us with the lure of pure profit that generates incentives, and the penalty of loss in disciplining us in our wishful conjectures. And politics provides the infrastructure, institutional infrastructure within which all this economic activity takes place. So you start out by pointing out that without private property rights, you're not going to be able to get prices. All right? You're not going to be able, without property and prices, you're not going to get the profit and loss signals that are necessary for the disciplining. And the politics, lack of a better word, provides the institutional infrastructure to secure private property rights, assure freedom of association and freedom of trade. Okay, so here's the, this is going to be too complicated. Yvonne knew that this was going to happen, and he told me it was going to happen, so that means that he's a master teacher and I'm a schlub. I'm trying to squeeze a lot into a short bit, and I don't want to lose all of you. So here's the thing. In the LSE in 1931, when I got up on that stage, by the way, it wasn't in 1931. You might think it was, but it wasn't. But Hayek was there in 1931. When he got there, everyone in the room became a Hayekian. This huge, huge conversion. All these people were all Hayekians. By the end of the decade, none of them were Hayek. That's it. Everyone became a Keynesian. So this is one of the real interesting things. How the heck did that happen? How did everyone switch over to become a Keynesian? Hayek was perceived to have lost two major debates. The debate with Keynes and the debate with the market socialists. Now Hayek himself says he's the only person that he knows of that's gone senile and come back again. Right? Because what happened was he went into a period where he was one of the most famous economists in the world. 1946, when Keynes dies, he turns to his wife at the time and says, "I'm now the most famous economist in the world." And if you watch the rap video, that's not made up. It really was a titanic battle between the two of them. But then Hayek was the most famous person for like a nanosecond. And then everyone's like, "Nope, don't really like you. You know, you're kind of boring. Right? We don't, we're done with you." And Hayek sort of totally rejected the Keynesian system and went off in his own way, focusing on institutions. Whereas Milton Friedman then took up the charge and stood inside of the Keynesian system and blew it up from inside. It's a brilliant intellectual move what Friedman did, right? To step inside basically a Keynesian framework and then first pick the consumption function, then pick, demand for money function. Next thing you know, the ISLM curves look the opposite of what everyone thought they would, and Friedman wins, right? But he blows up a system that's not a totally coherent system, so Friedman had to give way to then his students, like Lucas and Sargent and all of those guys, who came with a whole different theory. And who did they go back to? Hayek. And that's how Hayek went senile and came back again, because he came back in vogue, and then he wins, after he wins a Nobel Prize and stuff. But in the 1930s, what you have to understand is that Hayek is sitting in a situation where all of his students believe him, and then the next thing, it's like Professor Pongrasic is sitting here. Andrew, is that right? So you worked with Professor Pongrasic a lot, somewhat? Yeah? Yeah. So here you are. So imagine right now, socialism, you don't really like it very much, right? Obamacare going to solve all our health problems? We're going to live to 100? No, you don't really like that, right? So imagine that, right now, you're having this conversation with him. Now, time machine. End of the decade, you come into him and he says to you, "Yeah, socialism." You're like, "It's the way to go in the future. We can do it. We just tell the central planner to price equal to marginal cost, and it's good." And then he says, "What do you mean? How are these programs? They're no, way to go! Look at us. We're living healthier and everything. It's great. Obamacare. Let me sign up. Way to go." What's he going to say? Right? He sits there and goes, "What the hell happened?" Now he has two hypotheses. Either you've gone delusional, right? Or there's something deep in our intellectual culture that has warped your brain. What did Hayek decide to think? Deep in our intellectual culture has warped your brain, rather than these brilliant, students that he worked with all of a sudden becoming like nuts. And so that explains Hayek's move in the 1930s out of economics, in that big long thing, into areas of philosophy and into areas of legal theory and into areas of political theory. Because there was something in intellectual culture which didn't allow you to understand the truths that you once knew and clouded your mind from those. And part of this is, in fact, what's going on here. Because the British socialists believed they could combine liberal democracy with socialist planning. And that's what the road to serfdom, right, is trying to point out, is that these are the different people, Dobb and Lerner and Durbin. We can't go through this. So the road to serfdom is this tragic tale of socialism ends up by putting into practice things that if you knew that that's what would be the result, you would never advocate for them. So imagine, again, if you could show that Obamacare ended up by providing worse health care than what we currently have. Would the advocates of Obamacare still advocate for it? Right? Right? Some, you might say some might, right? But many wouldn't, advocate for it. And as a result, that changes the kind of idea. That's how Hayek presented his argument. All right. So again, I ran out of time. Let me just finish with this last slide. Sorry, you knew better than me. In all humility here. What is the relevance of Hayek today? Read Hayek. It's very cool. First of all, he's old, yes, but it's very fresh when you think of it in terms of the debates that's currently going on right now. So one of the things that Hayek is challenging is the cognition, or he wants to push us in an epistemic or cognitive direction in economic science. That is, our focus should be on how knowledge is communicated and generated in economic systems. It's also how we have cognitive limitations. Think about this. When we make decisions, we're basically at a scissors. We have our cognitive capacity and we have circumstances of our choice. And it's that scissors that determine it. So it's not that we're engaged in irrational choices, behavioral economics and all that stuff, okay? They're wrong about what the nature of the choice set is. We have ecological rationality, not abstract or constructivist rationality, and we have to sort of understand that. I think you should talk to Professor Steele a lot. He's an expert on this issue about modeling knowledge in economics. One of his professors at NYU at the time when he was a student there, Aldo Rossacini, is a cutting-edge thinker on the ideas of the way in which we model knowledge. Sit down and talk to Professor Steele about these kind of issues. Fascinating stuff. Public policy. If you're a Hayekian, go back again to what I was saying about the rule of law. Think through that. That's a fascinating way to think about as a guide to public policy. Not about, look, in public policy it's really pretty simple. We have to first as economists design incentive-compatible policies, and then as a policy analyst think about incentive-compatible strategies that will get the policies through. Professor Wolfram has been, in this business. He can talk to you about that. You can have the greatest policies, but if they're not incentive-compatible strategies, you can't get them to go anywhere, so they're not really policies. They're just you shouting at the world. You have to sort of combine those things. But when you think about, from a Hayekian point of view, what Hayek is getting us to think about is the rules, right? The rules of the game under which we play, and that's going to dictate how we should do public policy. So one of my favorite little policy books is actually, Richard Epstein's two books, Simple Rules for a Complex World, but also Free Markets Under Siege, where he wants to focus on the idea of the rules environment. And then finally, and then I'll be quiet on this, and I understand I pushed your patience, but I think that Hayek, that coming out of this notion of the economic epistemics and policy focused on rules, we do end up with a ideological vision of radical liberalism, radical decentralization of our institutions, toleration of dissent, and what that environment takes place. So Chandran Kukathas's book, the Liberal Archipelago, I recommend, or anything by the Ostroms in the municipality debates. Those were big debates, local debates in the United States. Think about it this way. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had more school districts than we had at the end of the 20th century. Why? Because everyone thought we should consolidate the school districts. Milton Friedman sometimes referred to this as the football coach hypothesis, which makes a lot of sense. If I'm the football coach, I don't want to be picking between Schleppy and Sloppy, because I only have 3 kids in my senior class. I'd rather have 1,000 kids in my senior class, and then I have, the normal distribution, which means one of them will be fast. One of them will be fat. The fat kid blocks for the fast kid. I got a good football team, okay? But if I have Schleppy and whatever, and they're, you know, only this tall. So that's not necessarily true, but Friedman often pointed that out as one of the things in a sports-obsessed society. I love sports, by the way, so I'm sports-obsessed myself. So I was actually on a platform with Friedman, and I said, I would advocate the football coach mentality because I coach high school basketball for years, and the last thing you want to have is a 5'10" center. Please, don't give me that. I mean, we can, it's fun, you know, it's great. We can talk about spirit and all that stuff like that. Give me a 6'7" center in high school anytime. I love him, you know. I don't care what character he has, anything. All right. But we consolidated all these school districts, and what we did was we actually got worse school performance. All right? So what the Ostroms actually argued in the municipalities debate is the role of fiscal federalism and the incentives that it all has. Read that stuff. It's really quite interesting stuff. So we lead to decentralization as an outgrowth of our focus on epistemic communities and public policy as rules. We get this focus on decentralization. What you do with that, that's all up to you. But that's the science leading into a radical vision of the way in which we have our political structure. I apologize that I didn't get enough time for you to ask me questions. I'm a blabbermouth, but thank you very much.
Bye.